Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this conversation series on mental health, a one of its kind initiatives taken up by Making the Invisible Visible. I'm Shivani Shah, an architect by my education. I have been striving to study the intersection of architecture and psychology, and I believe design can have a profound effect on mental health and well being. I have worked extensively in my undergraduate research project where I've tried understanding children with the spectrum condition of autism and how one can design a conducive environment for them.
Hi, I am Vikash Khatri. I am an artist, photo activist, and founder of Vedi Studio. Together, we both started this initiative, making the invisible visible.
You all must be thinking that what is invisible visible? So, let me tell you a little story. There was a time in my life where I was in pain, when I suffered and felt extremely alone. That was a time when I felt invisible.
यस और यह इनविजिबल का अनुभव बहुत पेनफुल होता है और ऐसी क्या चीज नहीं थी जो हमारे पास जस्ट वन कन्वर्सेशन एक ऐसी जगह जहां हम अपने बातों को शेयर कर सकें और लोग हमें बिना जजमेंट बिना एडवाइस सुन सकें ऐसा नहीं था कि लोग नहीं थे और सपोर्ट नहीं था हमारे पास बड़े कमरे थे लेकिन सोफे में बैठकर खिड़की किनारे हमारी कहानी सुनने वाला कोई नहीं था और हम एक दूसरे से बातें तो बहुत कर लेते हैं लेकिन क्या वाकई में हम वो बात करते हैं जो जरूरी है एंड विद दिस पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस मी एंड शिवानी स्टार्टेड टू द जर्नी टू मेक दिस इनविजिबल कंसर्न विजिबल हमारी यात्रा बहुत लंबी है लेकिन हम हर यात्रा की शुरुआत पहले कदम से होती है और हमारी इस यात्रा का पहला कदम यह है हम एक ऐसे प्लेटफॉर्म या स्पेस बनाना चाहते हैं जिसमें हम सभी अपनी कहानियों और अनुभवों को एक दूसरे के शेयर कर सकें विदाउट हेजिटेशन क्योंकि बात करना जरूरी है
Yeah, very rightly said, Vedi. Unfortunately, mental health has always been invisible in our society. We rarely talk to each other about our struggles, weaknesses, inadequacies, and we rarely acknowledge people who do come out and speak. Often, those who do are burdened by the labels that are put on them by the society. And that is why this series is very important. It has an objective to break the stigma around mental health, normalize these conversations, and bring in a sense of togetherness and hope amongst all of us.
in this conversation series we are touching upon various aspects of mental health we started with taking about situation of crisis and how one can find meaning in these difficulties time और आज हम उस सब्जेक्ट में बात कर रहे हैं जो हम सभी के जीवन में किसी न किसी मोड़ पर अनुभव किया है असफलता नाकामयाबी फेलियर
Yes, and I'm really grateful that to have this conversation, we have Dr. Pavan Mamidi with us. He's director of Center for Social and Behavior Change, Ashoka University. Previously, he was the director of Center for Experimental Social Sciences, Flames University. Dr. Mamidi is interested in investigating social norms, trust, pro social behavior, and behavioral ethics using lab and lab in the field experiments. He has also been a faculty member at IIM Ahmedabad in the business policy area and has taught courses on empirical research methods in the doctoral program, along with law and negotiations and dispute resolution in several public policy programs for the government. He has taught in policy programs for senior government officers, including the IPS at the National Policy Academy and IAS at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration in Missouri. He has held positions at IIM Bangalore, MIT, the University of Michigan Law School, and Harvard School, where he is an affiliated faculty at the Center on the Legal Profession. Dr. Mamidi has an LLM from Harvard School and a doctoral in sociology from the University of Oxford. I'm really grateful, sir, that you're here with us on this platform. And thank you so much for accepting this invitation and being really open about your experiences and coming here and sharing it with us.
Thank you,
And
Shivan.
yes, sir, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for including me in your conversations. I'm most grateful to you for giving me a platform to talk about my failures and to talk about failures in general and why it is important to talk about failures, to analyze failures, to normalize them, to humanize them. So the first question that I'd like to address is, why am I even willing to talk about my failures? Uh,
Yeah,
well, I mean,
to
it's
know that. Like, what motivated you to join
yes.
this series?
So Shivani, I mean, it's not normal for people to talk about failures. We hide behind shields of illusion. We hide behind walls of privacy. And as a result of this, as we travel through society, we tend to only display what we have succeeded at and what we are good at. Because the assumption here is that we live in a competitive world, and that competition uh, displaces cooperation. The assumption is that we are a competitive society. And in a competitive society, we tend to hide failures and display only successes, right? But that has a net effect of distorting our understanding of human society itself, because all that we get to visualize is people's successes and not their failures. So the first reason that I have as to why I'm even talking about my failures is to suggest that talking about failures has an ability to humanize society. It could have consequences in terms of facilitating trust in society, facilitating cooperative behavior in society. Let me give you a quick and an interesting example from the world of behavioral science to explain what I mean by how failures, or rather how uh, information about uh, you know information about one's failures, or information that has which can which can go into what you would otherwise hide, tends to lead to cooperative behavior. Take, for instance, two gangsters, right? I mean, this is an example that I draw from Professor Diego Gambetta's research on the Italian mafia. Two gangsters have to try and strike a relationship in an environment in which there is a trust deficit. And one of the ways that in which that they can overcome this trust deficit is by sharing stories of their failures, or stories that can be held against, or stories about information that can be held against them. So in some sense, sharing of failures with each other can have the ameliorative effect of enhancing trust and cooperation in society. Well, these are all the theoretical reasons, but I also have a more human reason, and that is, I never turned down a group of students wanting to talk about what might be important for them. So I'm delighted to be here, and let me pause there and let you sort of guide the discussion as we go forward.
So, sir, like, thank you for saying this, because sometimes what happens, like, there are so many important things that we really want to do as students, but until and unless we really get support from mentors and people who really believes in the vision, I think that's the way forward for us. And you believed in us, and that's really more than enough for us to start on this whole conversation about failures, because most of us have experienced failures in life, and we have been taught to look at failures in a very different way. I mean, I have never been taught about looking at failures the way I look at success. So it's always about aiming for a successful place to be in, aiming for a very good position to be in, but we never really aim for what if there is a setback, what if we fail, what happens. then. So that's a position where we completely go uncomfortable, and then the challenges happen. So thank you for doing this with us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, sir, I have जब कोई भी फेल होता है तो ब्लेम उसके पीछे पीछे दबे पांव आता है. कभी हम खुद को ब्लेम करते हैं और कभी लोगों को ब्लेम करते हैं. So what is the role of blaming in understanding failure, and हम कैसे blame को समझ सकते हैं?
No, I think that's a great question, Vedi. So the issue of placing blame or on a negative consequence in society is not merely important from the discussion, from the point of view of discussion of failures, but it's also important from a legal perspective. There are lots of accidents in society, there are thefts and so on, and we constantly need to assign blame. And failures is one area where we tend to assign blame almost in a reckless manner. When a student fails, you tend to place blame at the feet of the student. Yes. When somebody steals a piece of bread, we tend to lay the blame at the feet of the person who's stolen the piece of bread, and so on. Being a part of the cause of a negative outcome in society doesn't necessarily mean that we need to place blame. Okay. All negative outcomes are usually co-caused by multiple co-causes. And to pick one of them and then blame just one of those tends to be distorted, right? Yes. So I think it's important to recognize that every time a student fails, maybe it's not the student who's mainly responsible for the failure in the examination, but maybe it's also a failure of the teacher, maybe it's a failure of the institution. Yes. So when you have co-causes which lead to the failure, just picking on the student, and then laying blame on that student, yes, can often be problematic. So we need to evolve a scientific basis or an interesting or a just basis or an ethical basis to assign blame for the failure. We have to humanize that process. And if you don't humanize that process, it can lead to very perverted consequences where people begin to, for instance, blame themselves unfairly. They tend to treat themselves unfairly. And that can lead to all the negative consequences in terms of mental health that you're talking about. So blame is a very important concept that one needs to understand and see it as an artificial social process by which you hold somebody blameworthy in order to be able to act on that person in order to change their behavior. And it's not often the case that the person who's being blamed is really the main cause for that particular failure. Right? So blame is something that we need to think. So we need to disentangle blame analytically from the way we treat the consequences of failure socially.
Yeah, true, very true. And when agree 100%, sir. Yeah.
Let me pause there. Yeah.
Yeah, like I have never heard someone talk about blame in a very in this way that you have spoken about, because look, this is a very new concept for me, and also the title that we had, that I had to have a question since then, that when you said that falsification of hypothesis, what do you mean by that particular statement, and what are scientific failures? That's something that I'm really curious about, actually.
Yeah. So science is essentially an enterprise, an activity where you form some calculated guesses about the way the world works, the physical world works, or the way humans behave. And you hold that contingently true. And then you go into the real world and empirically try to see whether what you have thought of is really true or not, right? So the impulse, the standard impulse is to try and corroborate what you have hypothesized, right? And philosophy of science tells us that the right scientific attitude is an attempt to actually make those hypotheses fail rather than make them succeed. So in some sense, scientific method has to necessarily depend on an institutionalized mechanism of trying to make hypotheses fail rather than be found true. So it's kind of paradoxical. But so what are some of the consequences? Let's think through this. Why failures arise in science? For every success that you encounter in science, there are a million failures that are antecedent to that success. I mean, can you imagine the number of times that Edison may have tried finding an appropriate filament that could work in making an electric bulb a sustainable product, right? So in other words, there was a huge stream of failures which ultimately led to that success. The other spectacular example that comes from history of ideas in science is the failure of this experiment called the Michelson and Morley experiment. I mean, some of you who have a background in physics will know what that experiment is about. So there was a particular time in the history of ideas when people realized that light is actually a wave. And as you know, I mean, common sense tells us that for a wave to operate, you need a medium through which the wave propagates. And so they made an assumption that the universe is filled with this invisible medium called ether. So they went around and said, okay, from a Newtonian perspective, they went around trying to find that medium. And they set up this elaborate experiment with mirrors and whatnot, right, on top of mountains. And they ran the experiments. And when they ran the experiments failed. The experiments failed to reveal the existence of this ether. So suddenly we are facing a puzzle in the world of science where you have an immense failure, right? So what do you do with that failure? And this is when the scientist Albert Einstein comes in and says, okay, this is a failure, but I think it's important to accept the failure and move forward and construct a theory based on the failure. So he said, and that's how he ended up constructing your entire sort of general theory of relativity. Your entire general theory of relativity is based on an antecedent failure of an experiment. And this happens systematically in all labs across the world. Until you have failed, you really are not advancing science. But here is the problem. Much like in schools, where we try to hide failures, when people try and go publish their scientific failures, right, they don't get published. So there are no incentives for people to exhibit their failures, right? So I think society needs to start changing and make a provision to allow people to say that we have failed in these regards, because that would then become wisdom for the rest of society to avoid those mistakes. So a free conversation about failures in the world of science and in our regular world is essential to finding successes. Let me pause.
I hope my teachers had taught me physics the way you are teaching right now, because the thing is that what I've always experienced is that education has always been very different from the emotions that we are being experiencing. So what we learn in physics and biology is at one side, but what we experience in day-to-day life is at one side. And this whole idea that I have been always talking about, that emotional education is very important. And now if someone can relate what we learn in school with the emotions and talk about it in a way you do, I mean, that will make science much more relevant actually, and the experience will become much more understandable. Because till this point in time, I think we all have developed that rational understanding that now for everything we need to have a meaning. If for everything we need to have kyun hua, either there has to be a purpose, there has to be a meaning, and we can't really enjoy anything in life without getting ourselves an answer to it. So I think for people like us, this kind of rationale to explain that what actually failure mean is very good and
No,
should
but
be
can,
propagated.
can I quickly jump in, Shivani?
Yeah,
Not only, see, what happens really is that when a scientist fails, rather than celebrate that failure as a great attempt at advancing knowledge, we go to the other extreme of ridiculing the scientist, right? So when Einstein came up with his theory of relativity, he became a victim of failure, I mean, a victim of ridicule, right? Rather than appreciating the fact that he took a risk in acknowledging a failure and assimilating it in the upgradation of a theory and thereby changing a paradigm, to borrow Tom Kuhn's language, instead of doing that, what do we do as a society? We heap scorn, right? We don't forgive people who fail. And,
right.
and that retards people from experimenting. And the moment that retards experimentation, there's no advance in knowledge.
Yeah,
Right? So acknowledging failures and celebrating failures lessens the cost for potential discoverers, potential creative people, and potential adventurers. Right?
true,
So
true.
we should necessarily invest in a certain measure of madness and adventurism in society.
Yeah. So, but what I've also experienced, and I have seen and experienced that when we fail, the biggest worry that we have is not that I have failed, but then it is log kya kahenge, society kya kahegi, and that is the biggest worry. So I wanted to know that, like you said, the ridicule and stigmatization that one experiences. Uh, what are your thoughts on the way these kind of experiences happen?
They're very severe. They're very severe. And because individuals, because our institutions are naturally oriented towards being unforgiving, I wouldn't, I would even go so far as to create a form of regulation which would mandate that we be more forgiving, right? So let me give you an example of how this works out in the world of law, for instance. So let's say there's a doctor, right? And the doctor does something and that leads to a bad consequence. There are either of two ways in which you can react to this failure of the doctor. I mean, let's say the patient died. One way is to have a fine against the doctor, no matter what the doctor has done, right? Now, that is one particular kind of a response. The other kind of a response is examine whether the doctor has actually done his or her best, and then evaluate whether, there can be some punishment that can be levied on the doctor. So in other words, if somebody has undertaken the requisite steps humanly possible, then you should wive the punishment. So waiver of punishments, waiver of punitive damages against people who do their best, I think is an institutional mechanism that can allow us to accommodate failures in society. Right? Otherwise, if you're not willing to forgive a doctor who does his best or her best and leading to a death, then people will not enter the medical profession. Right? So we need to find contractual and institutional and regulatory mechanisms by which and cultural mechanisms by which we are able to say, if a child fails in a school, let's not be unforgiving. Parents need to change. So it's a huge change that we are demanding of society to make people more forgiving of failures. I don't know if I've answered your question, but the broad direction is to become a more forgiving society, Shivan. And that's not an easy thing, right? I mean, we can't get people to wear masks. And now expecting people to become forgiving is going to be a much taller challenge.
Yeah. So very true, sir, very true. And I really want to know, I'm agree with you, and I want to know कि it's very easy to say learn from the failure. And बचपन से हम लोग ये सुनते आ रहे हैं कि अपने असफल हुए तो कोई बात नहीं, सीखो उससे. But how it's possible to learn, really learn from the failure? Like saying is easy, but it's learning from the failure is very difficult. So
I think learning from failures requires introspection and an ability to get past denial. The first step, I think, the first step that an individual can take to learn from a failure is to pause a little and then try and analyze the causes that have led to the failure, right? You will stop learning the moment you very quickly assign blame onto yourself falsely, and then you have paralyzed your ability to learn from the failure. So I think you should treat a failure as an event, as a scientific event, and then go into an examination of the core causes that have led to that failure. Assign weights to those core causes, and that is new knowledge. If I have tried to invent a new machine and it is not working, I have to go back iteratively and examine its functioning and see why it's not working. Right? So you've got to treat each failure as an event, as a scientific event of a gap between your aspiration on one hand and the outcome that you were anticipating. Right? You've got to explain that gap. So there's got to be a demand for an explanation of that gap between your aspiration and the outcome for you to be able to start making sense of the failure. So you need to pause, you need to introspect, right? Rather than suffer the consequences of the failure right away. That's our instinct.
Yes. I mean, this lockdown has also taught us the same thing, to pause, to introspect, and to think about what is it that we have been doing and reflect on the activities that we are going through. And honestly, in this lockdown, I have been trying to think about the way we have taken life up and how from one thing to another we are constantly jumping. From my education, I jumped into a master's, from a master's and jumping into another thing, and it feels like I don't know what is it that we are trying to do, but we are doing something in order to fulfill something. And what is that something? It's still unknown to me. And that is what I've tried to analyze in this period. And as you rightly said, that it's important to pause and introspect and think.
You need to pause to smell the roses. As I always told my students you need to pause.
Right.
You need to slow down. You need to slow your thinking. You can't rush through life. And there are some, maybe traditional practices such as mindfulness and even perhaps meditation, which can help you, slow down your cognitive processes in such a way that you're able to take a more systems to perspective of what has happened in your life.
Right. So I was just wondering, because what is when is the threshold? We say that slow down, but then there is a difference between slowing down and stopping completely. So how do one really understand that where is the threshold between the two?
I don't know if I have an answer to that, a good answer to that question. That's a great question. I think one needs to slow down every day. I think one needs to consciously cultivate a particular period in the day when they slow down and perhaps put pen to paper and then start thinking about what they have been doing and what they wish to do, right? It's a good idea, for instance, to have a gratefulness diary. There's this behavioral scientist who's taught that, I'm borrowing this idea from someone else. And what she talks about is a fundamental aspect of human nature. So as you progress in life, as you go living your life, you have some spikes of joy and you have some downward facing spikes of failures. But there's something called loss aversion. And what that does is it forces you to remember the losses rather than the benefits. So much so that the losses, the depression caused by losses accumulate, and you're systematically forced into becoming a sadder person. So one way of correcting that is by maintaining a simple diary of gratitude, which, every day sit down and write about the good things that have happened in your life. And that might actually change the ledger book in your life. But coming back to your question, at what point do you not paralyze yourself by inactivity is a great question. Maybe perhaps one of the ways of detecting that point is to see if the pain becomes unbearable. I'm reminded of this wonderful lyric written by arguably one of the greatest songs ever written by the Beatles, called Hey Jude. And it says, anytime you feel the pain, refrain. Don't carry the world on your shoulders. I'm not quoting them well, but that's perhaps an indication when you need to say, I'm going to take it easy now. I'm going to step back and not bear the brunt of that responsibility and load my head with that. Right? That's the time that you need to become introspective. That's the time that you need to start thinking about stuff in a more deliberate, in a slower manner. Yeah. Let me pause there. Yes.
Yes, very true, sir. And so, like, would it be possible for you to try to explain us what is it that you felt and what were your feelings while you were experiencing failures?
Oh, Shivani, my list of failures is spectacular. I mean, I have failed in a million ways. To start off with, I was a terrible student. I failed. Every day of school was a failure, right? And I can't even begin to describe in detail how many ways that I failed, and in how many ways I have been reminded that I'm a failure as I went through our education system, right? I mean, back in the day, we even became victims of great violence perpetrated by these so-called great teachers, right? And they were always constant, vivid reminders. We were all victims of corporal punishment. I mean, there's a whole generation of students who were punished very violently. And these acts of violence in classroom that were perpetrated against us were reminders of our failures in a million ways, right? Now, some of us were not fortunate enough to escape the negative consequences of those reminders. But some of us, by a stroke of luck, found mentors who could tell us that we are not to blame for those failures, that those failures are a byproduct of reasons that began a long time before you were even perhaps born, right? And the successes of the so-called meritocratic students were not on account of their own excellences, but again on account of antecedent conditions and circumstances and privileges that students experience. So the difference between a successful student and a failed student is really one of opportunities and not about the individual, right? So failure as a lawyer, I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to be a mathematician, right? And then I failed my bachelor's in a glorious manner. I got a grand 0 in my mathematics, right? That's not because I did not love mathematics. I continue to love mathematics. And now I'm in that happy state where I refuse to be good at mathematics, or I refuse to be better than other people. I only want to do mathematics and physics because I love doing them, right? So one way that you can escape this cycle of this oppressive pressure that is laid on you is to find that space to think a little about how is blame being constructed with regard to your failures? Right? Yeah. So today, I mean, when I go and teach at these IIMs or at these IITs or wherever, people are shocked that such a absolutely stunningly stupid student from the Indian education system can even dream of stepping into a classroom of these really successful people and be a teacher.
I like the way you've described it and putting the adjective of glorious because that just makes it see in a very different manner. And I'm very happy that you shared it because we have on this platform with us 2 more people who are, I think, waiting eagerly to wanting to have a conversation with you and also to share their experiences.
Absolutely,
So,
with pleasure.
yes, so we have Khushbu Singhvi. She is from Indore and has done her master's in physics. She is currently assistant professor at Sri Jain Shwetambar Professional Academy, and right now she is going to pursue her PhD. So thank you so much Khushbu for coming up. And आज खुशबू हमारे साथ अपनी लाइफ का एक एक्सपीरियंस शेयर करना चाहती है और फेलियर्स के बारे में जब बात हो रही है तो खुशबू इस चीज में कुछ बात करना चाहती थी. खुशबू, थैंक यू सो मच एंड द स्टेज इज ऑल योर्स.
Such a pleasure to meet you, Khushbu. And I love physics. I'm not good at it, but I love physics. So let's talk physics if you want to.
Thank you so much, Shivani, for giving me such a great platform. And thank you so much, sir, for making us realize that one should need to take a pause in life to understand something, to achieve something. Thank you so much. Now, Shivani already introduced me that I teach physics, but nobody knows why I teach physics. There's a short story behind this. When I was in 12th, अगर हम देखा जाए तो बोर्ड्स का एग्जाम था हम लोगों का, और एज की जैसे हम लोग बहुत प्रिपेयर करते बोर्ड्स के लिए, तो सेम थिंग हैपेंड विथ मी कि मैंने बहुत प्रिपेयर किया, पेपर्स भी बहुत अच्छे आ गए थे, बट जब रिजल्ट डिक्लेयर हुआ तो आई जस्ट स्कोर लोएस्ट मार्क्स इन दैट पर्टिकुलर सब्जेक्ट. दैट सब्जेक्ट आई लव द मोस्ट, दैट आई रियली पैशनेट अबाउट इट. आई scored 146 out of 100. That is too low, and that take me to the depression side कि भैया मैंने तो इतना पढ़ा है, ये मेरा सब्जेक्ट है और इसमें मुझे इतने कम मार्क्स कैसे आ सकते हैं, और मैं इसको रियली एक्सेप्ट नहीं कर पाई. मीनवाइल मेरा टोटल स्कोर भी अच्छा नहीं था, और उस टाइम इंजीनियरिंग का एक बूम था कि सबको इंजीनियरिंग ही करनी थी. मतलब लाइफ में हमको एक ही चीज सिखाई गई थी कि आपको 12th के बाद इंजीनियरिंग परस्यू करनी है, और कोई अदर ऑप्शन हमें पता नहीं था. बट मेरा स्कोर इतना लो होने के कारण मुझे इंजीनियरिंग में कुछ मिलने नहीं वाला था. देन आई डिसाइडेड कि नहीं, मेरे को पढ़ाई नहीं करनी है, क्योंकि अगर मैं कुछ और करूंगी तो लोग क्या कहेंगे, लाइक व्हाट माय फ्रेंड्स थिंक. क्योंकि मेरे सारे फ्रेंड्स का स्कोर बहुत अच्छा था, सबको अच्छे अच्छे कॉलेज में एडमिशन मिल चुका था, तो मैं दूसरे कोई भी करियर ऑप्शन को चूज ही नहीं करना चाहती थी. एज अ टाइम पास 6 to 7 months ऐसे ही निकल गया. आई डोंट टेक एडमिशन इन एनी कॉलेज, और मैं इसी चीज को मतलब मैंने लोगों से बात करना बंद कर दिया, एंड धीरे धीरे मैं डिप्रेशन के थ्रू जाने लग गई. एट द टाइम मेरे पेरेंट्स ने मुझे रियलाइज किया, चलो स्टार्ट परस्यूइंग बीएससी. ही दे ट्राई टू कन्विंस मी कि आप बीएससी करो, बीएससी में करियर ऑप्शंस है. तो मुझे ऐसा लगता था कि वाई बीएससी, बीएससी को तो कोई जानता नहीं है, बीएससी की कोई इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं है लाइफ में, बीएससी करके मैं क्या ही करूंगी, तो लेट्स ड्रॉप कि हमें पढ़ाई ही छोड़ दो. तो मैंने पढ़ाई छोड़ दो, ये बेटर ऑप्शन मैंने चूज किया. बट फाइनली कि मुझे ग्रेजुएशन करनी थी तो मैंने बीएससी चूज किया. एज अ टाइम पास मैं धीरे धीरे बीएससी पढ़ने लग गई, थोड़ा थोड़ा समझ में आने लग गया, बट मैं सेटिस्फाइड नहीं थी. मुझे रोज डर लगता था कि कभी मेरे फ्रेंड्स ने पूछा या मेरी फैमिली ने मुझसे पूछा कि आप क्या करते हो, तो मैं कॉन्फिडेंटली नहीं बोल पाती थी कि मैं बीएससी करती हूँ, क्योंकि मुझे लगता था कि बीएससी तो कुछ है ही नहीं, मतलब उसकी कोई इंपॉर्टेंस ही नहीं है लाइफ में. इंजीनियरिंग नहीं किया तो आपने कुछ नहीं किया लाइफ में. बट ऐसे जैसे मैंने बीएससी में एग्जाम्स दी और मेरा स्कोर रेट आया, मैंने फाइनल ईयर में अपने आप को फर्स्ट पोजीशन मैंने स्कोर किया उधर जाके. तो एक कॉन्फिडेंस बिल्ड अप हुआ कि नहीं, हम इस में भी अपना करियर बना सकते हैं, क्योंकि हम उस सब्जेक्ट को पसंद करते हैं। और ये जरूरी नहीं है कि हम सब्जेक्ट को पसंद कर रहे हैं और जो हम एक्चुअली चाहते हैं वो हमें मिले ही। तो अगर आपका एक रास्ता बंद होता है तो शायद दूसरे बहुत सारे रास्ते हैं जो आपके ओपन हैं, और वही चीज मुझे थोड़ा सा कॉन्फिडेंस दे रहा था। मैंने धीरे धीरे टाइम के साथ ये एक्सेप्ट करना स्टार्ट कर दिया कि अगर मैं अपने सब्जेक्ट को दूसरों तक पहुंचा पाऊं तो दैट इज द बेस्ट वे कि आई लव, मतलब बेस्ट वे टू सेलिब्रेट माय सब्जेक्ट विथ माय सब्जेक्ट एंड विथ माय फेलियर. So I pursued for MSc and then I moved towards the teaching as a professor in physics. Then
Wonderful.
I continued my teaching I am teaching from last 5 to 7 years. And then when I teach physics, that really makes me happy कि like हाँ, मतलब मैं अपना knowledge, अपना subject दूसरों तक पहुंचा पा रही हूँ. Even जब मैं ये चीज स्टूडेंट्स के साथ रिलेट करती हूँ तो मुझे ये फील होता है कि लाइक जो स्टूडेंट्स मेरे सामने हैं वो भी कहीं ना कहीं इन्हीं सब सिचुएशन से गो थ्रू हो रहे हैं, कि वो लोग अगर एक चीज में फेल हो गए तो वो उस चीज को एक्सेप्ट करना नहीं चाह रहे हैं, बट एक्चुअल में मैं उसी फेज से निकली हूँ. तो दैट मेक्स मी मोर रिलेटेबल टू देम, मोर कंपैरेटिबल टू देम, more friendly with them, so that they can open with me and I easily able to solve their issues and problem by telling them my story, my experience, so that they can boost up their self and not let them down or decided कि हम अपना सब्जेक्ट ही छोड़ दें या हम ये ऑप्शन ही क्लोज कर दें. क्योंकि जैसे ही रिजल्ट आता है, लाइक अगर किसी का रिजल्ट पूरा आता है तो सबसे पहला थॉट जो हमारे माइंड में क्लिक होता है कि हमारे आसपास वाले लोग क्या कहेंगे, और वो ही हमें पूरा पुल डाउन करके लेकर जाता है. बट स्टॉप थिंकिंग अबाउट देम, बी फोकस ऑन योरसेल्फ, बी कॉन्फिडेंस. ये लोग कुछ नहीं होते हैं. अगर हम हमारे सब्जेक्ट को पसंद करते हैं तो डेफिनेटली देयर आर 100 ways to celebrate the subject or to love that subject or to follow your subject.
No, Khushbu, a quick reaction. Let me tell you one thing. I truly admire your courage. You know, I wish I was as courageous as you have been. You know, I abandoned physics and mathematics. You stuck to it, right?
Yeah.
Let me give you a word of consolation. All those people who top their examinations, they're amongst the most boring people that you can meet in life. Trust me on this. I've taught at the best institutes in this country, particularly the Indian Institutes of Management. And I've seen the top rankers. They're so dull. They're so boring, right? And people who seem to do okay to keep their head above water, they often are much more creative in some sense. They have not compromised on they have not sold their soul to Mephistopheles to be number ones, right? So don't even worry about that. But what I find admirable in you is that you have persevered in maintaining your love for the subject. And that's the key thing. But there is, but let me add another point that might be helpful, and it could be of some strategic importance. Oftentimes, we think that because we love something, that it necessarily has to become our profession. It doesn't. I've heard of a lot of, for instance, brilliant mathematicians who work as doormen at hotels and restaurants in New York. Do you know why they do that? Because being a doorman or being a security guard doesn't consume their brain, right? And they can do their mathematics. So as long as you can find a portfolio of activities to earn your livelihood, and at the same time, you can package a certain amount of leisure that will allow you to pursue what you're passionately interested in, that's a fantastic combination. Lucky are, of course, the people who can do exactly what they love, but those people are very rare. But so find yourself an activity, an avocation, a profession that will earn you your livelihood, but protect that little space, personal space, the time that you can spend on things that you love. And then that becomes your own. Nobody can get in there and say you have failed. And in this day and age, I mean, with the opportunities of online education, you can learn anything. You don't need to go to an IIT. You don't need to go to an IIM. You don't need to go to a Harvard or MIT. You can sit at home and consume the most wonderful wisdom that there is out there, right? And pursue passions that you have always been interested in, right? But of course, there are several others who don't even have those opportunities. And answering, finding solutions to their situation is going to be a much greater challenge, right? But anyway, that could be a topic for a different discussion, but let me pause there. But Khushbu, warmest congratulations. You've done much better than most toppers that I know who occupy this landscape of the rat race, as it were.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you
Yes.
so much for your
Very courageous. Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Khushbu. It actually is very inspiring, and someone who has been facing it and speaking out loud here, a lot of people will be seeing this, and I think they will be inspired. And the sole purpose of this series is to talk about it and make each other feel relatable. And thank you so much, Khushbu. And we have one more person here,
Please.
and her name is Malini Sasidharan. She is from Kerala and is pursuing her master's in public space design from Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore. She has
Wonderful.
been researching on design for well-being and currently doing her final year thesis on toolkit for dementia friendly spatial designs. So we welcome you, Malini, and you're doing a wonderful job in trying to understand design and mental health conditions together. And
Terrific.
yes.
Hi, Malini. Such a pleasure to interact with you.
Malini, your audio is not proper actually. Can you try to... No.
You should cut the video, maybe. That will help.
Yeah. Maybe try starting. No, it's breaking actually. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I'm
No.
afraid not, Malini. Don't worry about it. I'm sure we can even have a conversation on the phone.
Yes, maybe you can type in the question that you wanted to ask for so long in the chat box. If not, because these kinds of things do happen on a live session, and it's a kind of
Don't even worry about it.
Yes.
Don't even worry about it.
Can I try rejoining?
No, you're
Yes.
perfect now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for letting me be part of this wonderful conversation. And I feel very privileged to be part of people who are trying to make conversations about ourselves. We couldn't get to know each other, but even I happen to love physics so much. So I was very glad that you were one of the panelists. So, sir, right now, not that I don't have any failures, I have many, but I don't think I'm in a place right now to speak openly about them. So I have a question for you. It's both personal and public.
Sure.
We know that in today's world, especially this generation, coming generation, live in a society where you are exposed to a lot of content, knowledge through social media, virtual world. Like you were telling, those give us a lot of exposure. It gives us opportunities to learn. But I think there is also pressure, because people are doing, like how Shivani told, every day people are doing so many things. Like you see people doing so many things, as much as it's easy to gain opportunities and get exposure, but especially through social media, so I think I wonder whether it might be affecting the way people see failures, the way especially this generation's children see failures. because they are continuously under pressure. They are continuously seeing what other people do and what happens in other people's lives. So and I have heard that spaces like social media can become toxic sometimes too. Like it might point out your failures, or emphasize on your failures more than how much it should be. And I've come across that like through like behavioral sciences, where it is said that people become happy for the reasons that actually don't need not make happy. The reasons that we might perceive that we are becoming happy need not be the real reasons. I wonder whether that's applicable to failures too, like and especially how the social media is playing the role of the perception of failure. And I would like to ask you how you personally tackle the social media pressure, and also what would be your advice for us and the next coming generation to tackle it in a proper way, the pressure through social media and the perception of failure.
So yes, so the social media question is a very important question, right? And I raised an earlier point, and that is, there is a natural tendency for individuals in public spaces. Forget about social media. Whether if you're walking in the park or you go to a movie, the way you clothe yourself, the way you engage in self-presentation is to accentuate your excellence, right? Whether it be for mate selection or whether it be in terms of conversation, whether it be for other purposes. You're constantly under the pressure to exhibit only the good side. And what that does is it leads to a distortion. It leads to a weeding out of all the negatives, and it only sort of accumulates the positives of you. And what that does is, as individuals at an individual level, when I see only the positives emerging in this public space of exhibition, I start comparing those with information that I have about the negative things that I know, that I privately know. And that creates a cause for unhappiness. And now, fast forward to an era where you have social media. And social media, so in a public space, you meet 10 people who are doing this. But in a social media context, on a platform, you have 10,000 people doing that. So in other words, there is a sudden spike in this selective accumulation of information, selective curation of information, of only happy information. People going off on exotic trips, or people celebrating some success in their work. These platforms have become platforms of exchanging only stories of success. And that can lead to a lot of unhappiness. So one of the ways to face this, first of all, I would suggest that you detoxify yourself off social media at some measure, right? It's not a good idea to. I think most of us need to reduce our social media consumption. Social media can be very, very powerful in giving us great information. It can lead us to forming, opinions and so on and so forth. But it can also have this really perverse effect of loading just happy news in your face, which you then compare with your unhappy news, and that produces unhappiness, further unhappiness. So one way to perhaps negotiate this challenge is by becoming self-aware, right? Self-awareness is a potential way. The moment you become self-conscious of this particular dynamic, of this social process by which you're pitting yourself against 10,000 other people who are doing all these wonderful things, right? You become a victim. But the moment you become self-conscious, maybe you can pull yourself out, right? That's one potential way. The second thing that I want to also alert you to is the fact that when people are in a public media, they also try to signal only their excellences, right? Conspicuous consumption. This is a thing that, Thornstein Veblen has talked about. He's a sociologist. He says, People are continuously, but for instance, the neo-rich, they buy these expensive cars and they need to find a way to signal their latent attributes of great prosperity and wealth to the society at large. So social media has become a platform for an exhibition of conspicuous consumption. And what does that do? It builds hierarchies continuously. And these hierarchies and these asymmetries lead to unhappiness. So, there's no easy answer to this. One way, very good way of getting out of this trap is to dilute your exposure to social media, and second, become aware of this specific fact,
Right.
that there is a selection effect.
True.
You're not seeing the other side, you're only seeing one side, and that's a very distorted, that's a biased sample of experiences that you see.
Yes, that reminds me of this theory that I have been learning in environmental psychology, which talks about selective attention theory. And it talks about when you have a lot of stimulus in the environment, we have this capacity to block the unwanted stimulus and only take the information which is relevant.
There
And
you go.
that's what we need to use here as well.
Absolutely, that makes sense. That does make sense.
So we have Malini, thank you for asking this question and bringing up this topic of social media over here.
Thank you, Shivani, and thank you, Dr. Pavan, for such an inspiring talk and also very useful tips regarding,
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
There's a question coming up in the Q&A, and I think I really would like to take that up. And the question is by Kartika, and she wants to ask that how can one deal with people who demean and insult you openly because you have chosen a path that they don't understand themselves, but perceive you as a failure for choosing to do so?
Avoid them like the plague. Avoid them like the plague. The reason why you need to avoid them like the plague is that, and oftentimes, and this is something that I wish I had learned earlier in my life, there are toxic people who present themselves in the form of being your friends, right? And these are people who pull you down. Just avoid them. Become self-conscious of this. Find yourself a friend, even if you are unable to, because you're subjectively involved in a relationship of friendship with this person, you're unable to see how this is a continuous feature of your relationship. It's a perverse relationship. Avoid it, cut it, move on. That is the straight answer to this. People who bring you down, get rid of them from your life. You deserve better.
Yes, I think that's a message. We deserve better. Everyone deserves better, and we keep on forgetting that in this day-to-day engagements that we are in. But that's a takeaway for me, actually.
No, but there is a word of caution that I add here. So you have toxic people, but you also have friends, well-meaning friends who are critical, right? Now, separating these two types of people is going to be a big challenge. You need to have, you systematically need to have people who can give you critical feedback, right? So one of the problems that, for instance, government officials face is that on account of the fact that they hold power, they're constantly surrounded by people who have a conflict of interest. And people who have a conflict of interest are always giving you bad information. So you never end up having friends who can give you critical information, people who can challenge you. So you need those people. So you need to deliberately cultivate friendships with people who can be honest with you. But you need to find a mechanism of separating those people from the toxic. Very important. That's a caveat that you need to be aware.
Yes, that's true. That's a very good differentiation. Some things are very much similar to each other, that when we have a bad experience, we either shut everything down completely.
That's right. That's right.
Like,
That's right. That's the knee-jerk reaction to toxicity, right? Because now you start adversely judging anybody who comes up to you and gives you an honest, frank opinion about something which can actually be valuable to you. Making friends with people who can be critical about you, inviting criticism from friends is a huge thing. You need to make that as an institutional process.
Right.
Go out and tell your friends, listen, I want you to criticize me. I want you to play the devil's advocate. And that can be a useful exercise.
Yes, I'm sure it can be. Right now, I would like everyone who has joined over here, we are going to release a poll right now. It will be displayed on your screen for a minute, and kindly feed your responses. The poll results will be shared in a minute after everyone has filled in. So I think it's on the screen. Please fill the questions. We've designed the poll questions in a way that we wanted to understand that how people relate to the experiences that we talk about here in the series. And also because the whole objective is to talk about breaking the stigma and notions around mental health, we also wanted to understand what are the notions that people do carry with themselves. And that is how the poll has been designed. And I'm sure it will. Yeah, I think we're getting answers here. I'm sharing the results right now. So there are 100% people who say that they relate to this experience. And I'm very glad because failures are something that we all have experienced but rarely spoken about. And also the way, sir, you have explained with the correlation of physics, that's something which is very new. So then a lot of people, 100% people feel that we should have more spaces and platforms like these where we can share and initiate personal life experiences. This is a space where so 25% people feel that they are not equipped to help someone with mental health problems, and I think that is where the next intervention should speak about, that we make the society equipped enough to create a support system for each other. And
That's right. A forgiving, to create a forgiving environment, and where there is psychological safety for individuals.
right. Thank you everyone for doing this poll and letting us know the experiences that you had. We are right now sharing a helpline number on the screen. This is provided by the Vendrewala Foundation. They're trained counselors, they are qualified and are available day and night. They will help you answer any question that you might have for mental health. So kindly reach out to them if you need any help, or pass it to someone that you might think really needs help. Yeah, this is I think it'll be displayed in a minute. This is a helpline number, and I think everyone should save this, because when 25% people feel that they are not equipped enough to help someone, this might be one way where you can try helping someone by providing this helpline number. So please do so. And now we are at the end of this whole conversation series, and it was a pleasure talking to you about failures and how we can see failures. So I'm really thankful.
Thank you, Shivani.
Yeah.
I'm most grateful to you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone to attending our second conversation today. I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Mamidi for being really brave and opening about some of his very personal experience in front of all of us. I am sure this will be encourage everyone to talk each other and support during the time of need and look at the failure in a way very different, in very different way.
Right. I also want to mention this very personal experience that we had with Sir. And when we were trying to create this whole idea of a very informal space where sharing can happen, this is not just restricted to this webinar, but every time we had an interaction with Sir, he made sure that there is a personal space and we are comfortable in that space, because being newly introduced to him, we were very nervous that how will we initiate this kind of conversation. But he but thank you so much for making sure that
Thank you.
not just the webinar but all the conversations happen in a comfortable space.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And I please feel free to reach out to me any which way that I can be of assistance to you. You know, it would be a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you so much. In parting, I just want to say one thing, and that is, your failures are not. You don't need to be blamed for all your failures.
yeah,
And that's a very important takeaway. And for the successful people, I mean, those of you who think that you're successful purely on account of your individual genius, you're wrong. A lot of you have succeeded on account of a lot of privileges that you have enjoyed in life. Thank you so much.
yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much. And I'm very much grateful to Dr. Arvind Singh, Director, Center of Wellbeing, Ashoka City, for mentoring us. Arvind ma'am is the first person जिन्होंने हमें ये स्टिग्मा तोड़ा कि हम मेंटल हेल्थ फील्ड के ना होते भी अपने लाइफ एक्सपीरियंस एंड स्टोरी के जरिए मेंटल हेल्थ के इन छोटे छोटे पहलुओं को सामने रख सकते हैं. So thank you, Arvind ma'am.
Thank you.
We are also thankful to Ishita Arora, who has been there for us and has advised us on various levels. And lastly, none of this could have been possible without Himanshu Sharma and the Live Action Project Committee and the Anand Fellowship team. These people have been a constant support, and even though this is an academic project, I think we have been giving a lot of efforts, and we are getting the equal support from the team, and that is what matters. There are a lot of friends as well. Like sir, you said that nothing is that we can do purely on our own, and there are so many friends who have been constantly motivating us, and
Very
they
good.
are like a backup option with us always. So those are the
Wonderful.
things that we really
Wonderful.
thank here.
Thank you. And we all are very thankful to all the people who have joined today and helped make this series possible. We will be back on next Saturday, 18 July at the same time. And we talk about some of the most passing day-to-day issue related to mental health from real life experience. We will have the Professor Indira Pari, founder, president of Flame University, talking about the problems she managed in her social space with creating workspace. Hoping to see you all.